So today we are going to talk about 1099Ks. So 1099Ks are a little bit different than your 1099 miscellaneous or your 1099 NEC. So what a 1099K is, it is a report. So it's a 1099 that's going to get issued to the IRS, and it reports the amount of money that has been run through a payment processor, essentially. So if you're using a company like Stripe, like Square, like PayPal to manage your transactions, you will receive a 1099K. Okay, and there's a lot of questions about how 1099Ks work because there's been a recent change to the threshold for 1099Ks. All right, so I'm going to talk to you about what 1099Ks are, that change in the threshold, and what you need to be doing with your 1099Ks. Okay, so before the year 2022, gross payments that exceeded $20,000, or if you had more than 200 transactions, that payment processor would issue a 1099K. Okay, and most payment processors didn't necessarily pay attention to this $20,000 limit. They would issue that 1099K anyways if you had like $10,000 come through. So the 1099K is just a informational report. And that payment processor is sending it to the IRS saying, under this EIN or under this social security number, we have collected $10,000, $20,000 of revenue for this particular EIN or social security number. What the IRS then goes and does is they're going to look at the returns associated with that EIN or social security number. And they're going to make sure that the gross income that you're reporting is at least that of which is reported on the 1099K. Okay, so if you have a 1099K that says this individual or this business brought in $100,000 and you're claiming only $50,000, that's a mismatch, right? So that's a way that the IRS can easily identify a company that has underreported income. Now there's a couple of different things though with the 1099K. All right, so 1099Ks are issued by payment processors, and sometimes what will happen is if you have a client that is paying you for services and then they issue you a 1099, they may not realize that they're not required to issue a 1099 if that transaction is subject to reporting on a 1099K. Okay, so then you have double counting of your revenue across these 1099s. Okay, the other thing that you may see is that the 1099K is getting issued, but it may not be for a specific business purpose. For example, sometimes these 1099Ks are issued for things like a GoFundMe to help cover somebody's medical expenses if they had a tragedy in their family or something like that. And in that case, just because you received a 1099K, that does not mean that that income is taxable. Okay, but you may have received one of these forms, and then you need to explain why you received one of those forms. Other times in which these types of transactions may not be taxable would be something like maybe you went through and you cleaned out your house and you sold a bunch of your clothing, your furniture, whatever it may be, and you sold it for less than what you paid for it. And then when you got paid like via Venmo, people marked it goods and services. You'll get a 1099K saying, hey, they sold this amount of goods and services through Venmo, but really you didn't make any money. You actually lost money selling those items because you sold those items for less than what we call your basis, which basis in general, like a simplified explanation, is essentially what you paid for it, less any deductions that you've taken for it. So if you sell something for less than your basis, generally that's not a taxable transaction, but you may have received these 1099Ks. So if you're in one of those positions to where the 1099K is reporting income that it's not taxable, you may want to include a disclosure with your tax return explaining why there was a 1099K issued and why it's not taxable, just to get ahead of the IRS and say, hey, like, listen, I know that you guys received a 1099K, but this is why I didn't report taxable income associated with that 1099K on my tax return. Okay, that way, if they go and they flag the return for audit, whoever reviews that return can see, oh, okay, well, this makes sense. You know, they got a 1099K because of a GoFundMe. Those are gifts from other people. They're not taxable. Now, there were some changes for the 1099K that a lot of people had questions on. So you'll see here, this is the IRS website, and it is showing what the 1099K threshold is. Notice how much higher it is for years prior to 2022. So it's gross payments that exceed $20,000, or it says 200 transactions. Now, for calendar years after 2021, so for the calendar year of 2022, the gross payments for goods and services that exceed $600. So the threshold went from $20,000 to $600. Okay, that's a huge change. So a lot of people have a lot of questions. Well, what happens if I receive a 1099K for $700? A lot more people are going to be receiving 1099Ks than they have in the past. Now there's, so there is, if you'll look here, the IRS announced in December of 2022 that 2022 is going to be considered a transition year. So there was so much confusion with the $600 limit or threshold that the IRS said, you know what, we're going to do a transition year for 2022. So really this is going to affect 2023, but just keep in mind that you want to make sure that that you are looking at your 1099Ks, okay, and seeing if there's any sort of mismatch of information. So as a business owner, what do you need to do with your 1099Ks? You need to make sure they're right. There may be errors on them, okay? Make sure you pull your 1099Ks, which are oftentimes sitting in your portal for your payment processor. So you want to pull your 1099Ks, you want to look at them and make sure that that amount is accurate. And then you also want to compare your 1099K to other 1099s that have been issued to your company. Make sure that there's no double counting there, okay? What if there is double counting? Like, what if a customer paid you via credit card, but they still reported that information on a 1099 miscellaneous or a 1099 NEC, even though it's sitting on your 1099K? What do you do in that instance? Well, you can reach out to the customer and say, hey, you know, I already got this on my 1099K. This was already reported on my 1099K. You didn't need to send me one of these. Could you please adjust it? Hopefully they'll adjust it. And if they don't, then you just need to be prepared, potentially putting a disclosure on your tax return, depending on how much revenue you're claiming as opposed to your 1099s. If your 1099s are inaccurate, but they're still not adding up to the total amount of what like your total 1099s are, that might not be something that you need to have a disclosure for. Just note in your records that the 1099s are incorrect, so that if you are audited, you can say, hey, like, this is my communication with the client. I tried to explain, you know, how the 1099s were double counted, etc. So those are 1099Ks. They're very different than other 1099s because they are from a third-party processor. There have been changes to the 1099 threshold amount. They went from $20,000 here to now $600. But there is a transition period for 2022 because of the confusion with the changes. It is possible that you will receive a 1099K for transactions that are not taxable. If that happens, you may want to make a disclosure on your tax return. So if you guys have any questions, let me know, and I will see you guys next week.